And now, The Money Show
with Stephen Grootes on 702.
Let's walk the talk.
The Money Show with Stephen Grootes is brought to you by Absa Corporate and Investment Banking, proud host of Beyond the Budget 2025, where they are reimagining inclusive and sustainable economic growth. Good evening. Welcome to the program. Well, lots going on today. One of those busy days in the general economy and on the markets. Inflation figures out today, 3.2%, very much at the lower end of what you could ever really expect inflation in South Africa to be. The problem is that you've had so much inflation, particularly food price inflation. Even when food price inflation is now very low, you still feel it. And it's still one of those moments, I think, that just tells you. I went to the supermarket just yesterday, and at the end of it, totted it all up and went, gosh, you sort of forget how much things have changed over the last 4 or 5 years. So inflation figures low, yes. Inflation still very much with you, I'm afraid to say. A little bit of, well, perhaps I would call it quiet drama out of Barlow World. So after all of the talk, the speculation, the takeover bid, the 120 Rand a share that the consortium was offering for shares in Barlow World as part of the takeover deal, in the end, only 36% of shareholders voted in favor of the deal. It was quite a big premium, 120 Rand a share. And that suggests that shareholders really are not very keen on this idea at all. I do wonder if the Silchester Group, they had said publicly they wanted 130 Rand a share. I wonder if they're just waiting it out, they want a bit more, or if this is going to be basically a no. There's still big questions about all of this because the shareholders also refused to vote in favour of the remuneration of independent board members. And you'll remember the fuss around Dominic Sewela. He's the CEO at Barlow World. He is also a member of the consortium that would end up owning Barlow World if this deal were to happen. There were some questions around how the board had allowed Sewela to stay on as CEO while also being a member of the consortium. Nothing illegal in this, but just a few questions around whether this was the right thing. Were shareholders perhaps suggesting they don't think it's the right thing? And certainly that's one way to look at it. I must just tell you, we did reach out to both sides in this, if I can call them two sides, the consortium. You have had a representative of the consortium that wanted to take over Barlow World speak to you before. Unavailable this evening. We also put in a bid to Barlow World, asked to speak to the board, the chair. Again, unavailable. The lines are, of course, open. Should either of you change your minds on 011 8830702 and 0214460567. I do wonder if this story is not finished yet in some way. If, in fact, we might still see a little bit more action about it, one way or another. And then Momentum, they said their earnings for the 6 months to the end of December up 50%. It does tell you how important weather is becoming to insurance companies. One of the big reasons why they're looking so much better is that they've had fewer weather-related claims. And of course, in an era where we've seen many floods recently, you can imagine how important that is to them. We'll speak about the future of insurance in about an hour from now. We'll speak to Graeme Codrington. You know the number, whether you're a shareholder at Barlow World or you just want to have your say on it, 011 8830702 0214460567. Voice notes as well on 072 702 1702. Beer is next.
702. Stephen is on The Money Show.
6 to 8 p.m.
Well, results out from the company Anheuser-Busch InBev today showing the global beer maker Grootes EBITDA by over 10%. Around the world, though, volumes were down by around 1.9%. But here, its local unit, you know it, of course, as SAB, South African Breweries, it grew the volume of beer it sold. Corona and Stella Artois are the brands that seem to be pushing ahead strongly. Boris Rivett-Carnac is the CEO at SAB. Boris, good evening. Thanks for your time. You were able to sell more beer here. Globally, your company sold less beer. How were you able to buck the trend?
Hi, Stephen. We had a very strong year in South Africa. I'm pleased to report last year the beer industry returned to growth. So 2023, actually, we saw a volume decline in the industry due to the economic conditions in the country. But last year, we saw the industry return to growth, and we managed to grow along with the industry. So this was around really investing behind our core beer brands, so that's Carling Black Label and Castle, but also our core plus and premium portfolio led by Corona and Stella Artois. So it really was about consistently investing behind our brands to deliver the growth. And fortunately, when you have a growing business, it often does result in strong financial results, which we were lucky enough to deliver last year.
When you talk about investing in the brands, I mean, what are you doing? You don't really want to change the recipe, I'm presuming. It's about marketing. It's about finding cheaper ways to do things, to move the stuff around. But I presume a marketing budget's a big part of it.
No, it's primarily around the sales and marketing budget. You're right, Stephen. It's certainly not about changing the liquid of our brands that have been around a very long time and liquids that our consumers love. So it's very much about investing behind the brands and how they show up in the market. So we've been very deliberate about increasing our investments in our brands that we really believe in, brands that we call mega brands. So that would be in South Africa, Carling Black Label, and Corona, and in our Beyond Beer portfolio, that's Flying Fish and Brutal Fruit. So it's about creating platforms for those brands. It's about making sure they show up in the trade, be that informal on premise, or where they're being consumed in the right way, so that consumers, we like to think, make the right choice when they're choosing which beer to buy.
Are you seeing people trading up or trading down in terms of which they're consuming? I mean, are they going from the sort of cheaper beers to the more expensive, or the other way?
So we have certainly in 2023, when the market contracted slightly, we did see consumers looking a lot for value. So trading up typically into larger pack sizes. So rather than buying a NRB smaller bottle, they would buy the larger can, the 500 ml, to get slightly better value, or even trading up into quarts, so the 750 ml pack size. So undoubtedly, people looking for value, especially when the consumer was being squeezed in 2023 and the early part of 24. But more recently, we've seen the market return to more typical people happy to treat themselves a little bit, buying a premium beer or trading into Beyond Beer. And certainly the long-term trend is for the premium beer market to grow ahead of the overall beer market. And we're starting to see that trend return.
So those specials that you see everywhere, where you end up buying slightly more beer for a slightly lower price, whether it be quarts, whether it be 500 ml cans, or whether it just be a case rather than 4 6-packs, those specials seem to work.
No, undoubtedly, when the consumer is under pressure, they are looking for value, and they will definitely shop around. So people are looking at broadsheets. They're trying to understand where the value is. And you need to be very close to that market dynamic to ensure that to maximize your sales.
You do produce and sell alcohol, nothing illegal about that. Many people do link alcohol, and particularly cheap alcohol, to violent crime. We all know murders happen in fairly large numbers around places that sell alcohol. And I suspect that government, no matter which party is involved, may come under pressure at some point to introduce stronger regulations around who can buy booze and when they can buy it. And I thought this might happen immediately after the pandemic. It hasn't, but at some point I suspect it will happen. Is government going to be a bit more interventionist in the selling of alcohol? Is that your expectation?
So, Stephen, no, we don't actually think that is the case. We think the current regulations, if properly enforced, do actually control the sale of alcohol. We have very clear rules around trading hours, the age of people that can buy alcohol. There is, speaking frankly, a slight issue with enforcement that we would wholeheartedly support increasing as an industry. But yeah, we will engage with government to ensure that any regulation changes that do come make sense, both for managing responsible consumption, but also ensuring the long-term viability of the industry.
The trend to non-alcohol beer, and you see this in all sorts of different ways. Certainly there's evidence in places like the UK, parts of Europe, younger people drink less alcohol than older people did at the same age. Does that worry you at SAB?
Not at all. We in fact have two very successful non-alcohol beer brands, and we are investing in them significantly because we see this as a very important trend, as you rightly point out. It's interesting, in places like the Netherlands and Germany, you often see more than 10% of the total beer industry being non-alcoholic beer. So undoubtedly a trend for the future, and something we support very strongly, because it really does help consumers to moderate their consumption should they choose to, and offering them choice and great quality products to do that is something we think is very, very important, not only now, but will become increasingly more important in the future.
We don't yet know what the budget is going to look like, but I'm sure there'll be sin taxes there, and I think given the arguments around VAT, there might be a temptation to hit alcoholic drinks quite hard. Would that have an impact on your volumes?
Yes, ultimately, always. We've been very deliberate in engaging with both National Treasury and Parliament around the increase in excise tax. We're very clear that our ask, we understand we need to pay them, but our ask is that the increases should be in line with inflation. And we have seen in recent times that Treasury has priced excise above inflation. And ultimately, that price gets passed on to consumers, which will impact volumes.
Boris Rivett-Carnac, thank you very much indeed. CEO at South African Breweries. Really appreciate the time.
The Money Show on 702.
Monday to Friday, 6 to 8 p.m.
You might have seen or heard discussions in the last few days about regulations around your home solar installation. What you have to do to make it compliant for your council or to Eskom. Many people in urban areas get your power through a council. So, for example, if you live in Joburg, you're supposed to register your solar installation with City Power. They do have a register of solar installations. Some reports, though, that if you get your power directly from Eskom, you could have to pay thousands of rand to make your system compliant. If that's the case, though, will people really comply? Could some rather go it alone, just cut themselves off completely from Eskom? David Cleasby is a technical specialist at the South African Photovoltaic Industry Association. David, good evening. Thanks for your time. If you install solar at your home, what does the law say you have to do? And I am talking not about a massive installation, a normal kind of bog standard solar installation for a home in a suburb.
Good evening, Stephen, and good evening to the listeners. So, most importantly for the listeners out there, it's to understand that firstly, the system needs to be installed by a certified and qualified installation company, and that installation needs to be done by a registered electrician, and that installation needs to be done in accordance with the national installation standards. That's the first requirement. Secondary on top of that is that the system needs to be registered with the distributor in question. So as you rightly mentioned, it either needs to be registered with City Power in Johannesburg or the City of Cape Town, or with Eskom if you get your power directly from Eskom. That's the first step. Okay.
So there obviously seem to be, and there seems to be quite a lot of confusion about this. There's some scare stories that if you power directly through Eskom, you might have to pay 50,000 rand to make your system compliant. If we have a normal system, let's say it produces 5,000 watts, right? Would compliance really cost that much? That seems insane to me.
Yeah, Stephen, I think that's one of the reasons why we came out with a handy briefing document that homeowners and business owners and installers, electricians can reference, that really lays out the process and what is required to get the system compliant with the electrical installation regulations and the various municipal bylaws and regulations. It's really to cut through some of the noise that we've seen over the last 3-4 weeks. Bottom line is you only have to register the system with one entity, so either the municipal distributor or with Eskom directly. Secondly, we've seen some of the reports around the costs being floated for getting systems compliant. And unfortunately, there are some steep costs associated depending what the distributor requirements are. But at SAP, we are really trying to work hard to get some common sense solutions to bring the cost down for homeowners and end users. To get the systems compliant, because at the end of the day, we all want systems that are compliant and that are electrically safe, both for the homeowners but also for upstream.
Sure. Okay. I mean, I understand that. I'm not arguing about that. What I'm trying to get to is a normal installation 5,000 watts, to use my example. Surely that could not be expensive to be made compliant. It's a normal thing. It's happening in many places around the country right now. I can't see why it would be expensive to comply. To put it another way, I can't see what Eskom would have to do that would cost so much money. That's what I don't get.
No, absolutely. Those costs are really more in line with large-scale commercial and industrial installations, where you need either specialized monitoring and metering, or you need really specialized protection. For a residential system, 50,000 Rand is way outside of the norm.
Okay. What would be normal? 2,000 Rand?
It really depends on the level of non-compliance. I've heard of compliance costing in the range of 15 to 20,000 Rand, but that's really working off of a low base. So if you've worked with a competent installer that's followed the national standards, it really should not cost anything more than 5 to 8,000 Rand. And that's really to get any upgraded metering, bidirectional metering, and then to get any sort of protection that's needed from the distributor side to get that in place. But a lot of the installers already install with the requirements of the distributor in mind. And then registration really is an administrative task more than anything else.
Okay. So, David, here's my concern. My concern is that some people are going to be told to comply, you have to pay X, even if it's just, say, 8,000 Rand. And instead of doing that, what they're going to say is, I no longer want to be connected to the distributor, City Power or Eskom. I'm just going to cut the line. I want nothing to do with any of it, and I'll go it alone. And I would imagine if that went to court, no court in the world could say you have to be connected to Eskom or City Power. And I wonder if this is going to lead to a big kind of fight in some way.
That's absolutely the worst case scenario, Stephen. That's what we're trying to avoid. So the messaging we're trying to get across is that in order for you to go off grid and to enjoy exactly the same service that you have with that grid connection, it's going to cost a lot of money. So from a cost-effective perspective, it is better to still have that grid connection that you can rely on. But being grid connected means you have to be a good grid citizen. And part of that is ensuring you meet all the safety requirements and so on. But what is important to note is that if you've got a grid connection and you don't meet those regulatory requirements, you do put yourself at risk as the homeowner if any sort of issues happen down the line. From an insurance perspective and from the distributor perspective, you could be held liable for any issues upstream. But further to that, I don't know if you've heard of the concept of a utility death spiral,
Sure.
where the really good paying customers go off grid,
Yeah.
and then they don't pay their accounts anymore. And that's a situation that neither us or the distributors want. So I'm sure there'll be a happy medium found in the future.
David Cleasby, thank you. Technical specialist at the South African Photovoltaic Industry Association.
The Money Show.
The markets.
Chris Stewart's a portfolio manager at 91. Chris, good evening. Well, a strong update from AB InBev. They're selling more beer in South Africa.
Yeah, good evening, Stephen. We did start the day with a pretty strong earnings update from AB InBev. Big beat on the earnings front. Good beat on dividends. Not really driven so much by volumes. As you said, volumes in South Africa reasonably good. But I think overall their quarter four volumes probably missed a little bit, mainly due to weakness in China and Brazil. But they have managed margins well over the period. That resulted in a strong beat at the EBITDA line, as well as a solid performance from a cash flow perspective, which I think is really what got the share going today. Big improvement in cash flow from operations due to working capital management over the period. That resulted in lower finance costs and a big earnings per share beat, a good dividend beat. Net debt to EBITDA below 3 times for the first time, I think, in a decade. I stand corrected there. And a pretty solid outlook statement with regard to free cash flow as well. So some share buybacks, some decent dividends coming through there, and investors liking that today.
And Bidcorp, we'll speak to them in a moment, but their results slightly underwhelming?
Yeah, a little bit, I guess. They're going to have to go some. It'll be interesting to see if they are prepared to commit to meeting consensus expectations for the full year. Remember, this is their first half. They're going to need a pretty strong second half in order to get there. I would say, looking at the numbers, probably a risk of small downgrades in the market. Talking to headline earnings per share up 6%, dividends up 7-odd%, revenue up 7-odd%, which was in line with the 4-month trading update that they'd given, but a little bit of margin weakness in the UK and Australasian businesses in particular. Again, the emerging market business, similar to AB InBev, looking a little bit better. And their outlook reads a little bit soggy, talking to consumption remaining under pressure, food inflation slowing quite sharply, but quite sticky inflation on the wages front is going to keep margins under pressure. That said, this is a business that grows both organically and inorganically. They had 8 small bolt-on acquisitions over the period. The balance sheet is still very strong, net debt to EBITDA at about 0.6 times, so they've still got plenty of balance sheet capacity. And they talk to plenty of merger and acquisition opportunities, both in existing and new markets. So the potential to hit some inorganic growth as well, which may get them over the line.
And quickly, if you can, Chris, NVIDIA results out quite late our time. First, since the launch of DeepSeek, a lot of direction people are looking for.
Yeah, the market's going to be hanging on this one. First time, I think we discussed earlier, the first time that NVIDIA have reported quarterly results since listing, where the share price for this quarter is in fact lower than it was on the previous quarter when they released results. Usually a pretty volatile stock on results day, and I think the market's going to be looking very, very closely at that for, I guess, some guidance on the greater AI theme, and obviously the tech stocks, which have been driving large amounts of total returns in markets across the world over the last 18 months or so.
Chris Stewart, thank you very much indeed. Portfolio manager at 91.
You're listening to The Money Show with Stephen Grootes, brought to you by Absa Corporate and Investment Banking, reimagining inclusive and sustainable economic growth at Beyond the Budget 2025.
Well, you know the number, 011-883-0702 and 0214460567. Victor, good evening. You're on the line from Gordons Bay. You want to talk about the solar power installation issue. Go for it.
Yes, very short. I just want to ask the question regarding why I register now. I've done my system 2 years ago, received it from a reputable company, APS, with COCs, which was provided to my insurance company for years of insurance. So you're not feeding back to the grid. You only use it for your own property. The only connection to Eskom in my house is the stove. So now the question is, why now are they asking for registrations after you have your COCs, you've done your stuff 2 years ago, and this requirement only kicks in now?
You know, Victor, I still have so many questions, and this is not a comment about David Cleasby. He's answering the questions as best he can. But I've noticed that Eskom has not been very forthcoming on this at all. And, I mean, I understand from a safety point of view, you need to know if there's still a current, even if the main grid is off. But that's the only thing I can think of. I can't think of any other reason.
Yeah, because we're not feeding back to the grid.
Yeah.
Okay? So that's the thing. You're isolated from the grid. So the power from Eskom only feeds the house for the stove.
It's one way.
You cannot run that from. So that's the only thing.
And I mean,
and you still have the prepaid meter, and I still pay for my electricity on my prepaid meter, and I can see my units which I use for the stove. The question is, I'm not feeding back.
Yeah.
I use it for my lights. I use it for my TV and features and all that. You don't feed back. So why do you need to register?
Yeah, Victor, I am afraid to say I can't answer. I understand the safety argument. That's the only thing I can think of. There's still so many unanswered questions about this.
The Money Show
with Stephen Grootes.
Well, in Cape Town this week, the series of meetings around the G20 gatherings, finance ministers, central bank governors, meeting from tomorrow. The B20 business groups already starting their gatherings. We also find ourselves leading the G20 during really a pivotal time in geopolitics. The US seems to be disengaging from Europe, from multilateral institutions. I wouldn't be surprised, frankly, if they pull out from the G20 before the end of the year even. One of the people who's been attending some of these meetings, watching it all closely, is the CEO at RMB, Emery Brown. Emery, good evening. Really do appreciate your time on The Money Show. A lot going on around the G20 and around us in the G20 at the moment. And I've sort of find myself asking this question all the time. Is this a moment for South Africa to really play some kind of leading role? Emery Brown, good evening. Are you with us?
Good evening, Stephen. Apologies for that. Thank you for having me on your show. I think for me, this is really an incredible moment for South Africa. It's the first time an African nation gets to lead the G20, groups that represents 85% of global GDP and 2/3 of the world population. And I think for South Africa, it's a chance to step up and show what we're capable of. But it's bigger than that. It's really, for me, about putting the whole continent and the global south on the map in a way we've never done before. We've got a unique African lens to bring to the table, issues like financial inclusion, sustainability, and trade that really hits home for us, but it actually also matters globally. So for me, for South Africa, it's our shot to shape the conversation and show that Africa's potential isn't just talk. It's really an opportunity to turn it into real influence.
I know there'll be a lot of demands for us to prove that you're a leader by standing up to the United States. Now, it's not nearly that simple. And isn't that one of the problems of the moment? How do you show in this moment that you are leading?
I think, for me, it's really about, one need to think about the United States, but it's really about what do we want to achieve through, the G20, the B20. And it's really about, kind of focusing on, I would say, the themes that's been put forward and see how do we play a role to shape how we think about these things globally. I mentioned the theme around, the solidarity, equality, sustainability. And I think that, when we talk about, say, for example, sustainability, lots of views about it. But, it's an opportunity for Africa to shine because we've got vast reserves of critical minerals for the clean energy shift. We can drive reforms in trade, agriculture, investments that all fits into these themes. And I think that, at the end of the day, for me, one really needs to focus on how do we achieve tangible wins? How do we achieve 3% GDP growth in South Africa by using this opportunity and really to shape our country, our continent's future and have a broader impact on the world?
Does it require, there are different types of ways of leading it. It's sort of easy in a way to stand up and say things. I think much harder is to kind of build the consensus, and that's very slow, quite painstaking, often behind the scenes work. Do you think we have the appetite for that?
Yeah, I think we are very invested in doing what is required to make things happen. And I think that we have shown that, in many ways, even in our country, how, we can really come together, we can form partnerships and we can have those conversations to see how do we meaningfully move things forward. You just take our focus on public-private partnerships. That's such an important, I think, mechanism to deliver growth, to build out sectors in South Africa such as agriculture. And I think that we've really, just what we've achieved in our country through the partnership between government and the private sector, we know how to do this. And I think it is a key aspect of unlocking what we are setting out to achieve through our presidency this year.
Emery Brown, thank you very much indeed. Really appreciate the time. CEO at RMB.
The Money Show
with Stephen Grootes, live on 92.7 and 106 FM, streaming on the Prime Media Plus app
and DSTV channel 856.
Well, the global food services company Bidcorp doing quite nicely, I suppose, in the second half of last year. Its revenue up 3.6%, earnings up 10% in constant currency terms. The group also saying that its street trade segment, so I suppose suppliers to higher-end restaurants, doing quite well in South Africa, despite what I kind of feel is a tough consumer environment. David Cleasby is the Chief Financial Officer at Bidcorp. David, good evening. You supply food to people who then sell it on, and you were able to raise revenue quite strongly while many economies around the world are still battling a bit. How were you able to do that?
Evening, Stephen, and to your listeners. Listen, I think it's just a case of, focusing on the correct customer base. We operate in very competitive markets on the customer end.
So, it's a case of really, in certain markets, we've had to, sacrifice a bit of margin on the customer end and try and grow volumes. And I think really it's just testament to each of our businesses in a very decentralized environment operating and focusing on that strategy and executing on it very well.
The fact that food price inflation is so low at the moment, and I remember your company saying last year it had all but disappeared, which was kind of the case. That must make it harder to raise prices, to raise revenue. Food price inflation is very low.
Absolutely, and I think if you look through these results, I think one of the real positives is that we've grown, on an organic basis, volumes across the world by at least 5%. So, in a low inflation environment, it is tougher. We do prefer a little bit of inflation. I think the inflation that we saw sort of 18 months to 2 years ago was too high. But we knew that would come off at some point in time, and it has. So it is easier with a little bit of inflation. And I think we're going to see some of that come back into the system because ultimately, we're dealing in processed foods, and that requires labor, and labor costs continue to escalate in most parts of the world.
You do also supply higher-end restaurants. It's one of the things you do. And if I walk through certain parts of Joburg, even sometimes in a sort of weekday evening, plenty of them seem to be doing a roaring trade. Are you still seeing strong demand?
Yeah, I think the South African patron has held up reasonably well. We don't service a lot of high-end restaurants. I think we're more focused on the mid-segment. But yeah, I think if we look at our businesses, generally it's been much tougher in that space, but generally the business has held up quite nicely. We have taken a bit of margin and obviously tried to grow market share, and it's worked. So, that's testament to the South African results, which have been excellent in this period.
It's interesting to sort of compare because it just tells you how consumers are feeling. What's the situation in China? I mean, their economy is going through a difficult time. It's an economy that really matters to us. Are you seeing a decline in demand for that kind of product there?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we've had to relook at our business. We've had a new management team in China for the last, 2 years, and they've been finding their feet, but they've been operating in a very tough space, and the consumer in China is under pressure. We don't think the stimulus measures that the government put in there have had that much of a positive impact. And obviously half of our business sits in Hong Kong. And Hong Kong today is a very different place to what it was, 5 odd years ago. So there haven't been a lot of visitors into Hong Kong, and that's obviously impacted the hotel trade and the restaurant trade there. So, we've had to manage the costs and cut costs where we can. We're repositioning the business to focus on maybe a slightly different range of products. But, having said that, if you strip out on a like-for-like basis, our China business actually grew sort of 8% in the period. So we do think it's probably bottomed, but we do need the consumer to come back to see some, real growth again.
In South Africa 6 months ago, we were all quite optimistic. The economy was going to turn up. There was a coalition, etc. That would be important for you, of course. Are you still as optimistic as maybe many people were then? Geopolitics has suddenly become an enormous economic risk. And here, David, need I remind you, we still don't have a budget.
I think it's been a good lesson, and maybe people have learned to respect one another a little more. And I'm sure we will get a budget at some point in time. And, hopefully they're focused on the right things. It's not only about taxing more. They've got to look at where the government spending is going and be more efficient in that space. Because I certainly believe there's enough money to go around. They've just got to spend it more efficiently.
David Cleasby, thank you very much indeed. Chief Financial Officer at Bidcorp. Really appreciate the time on The Money Show this evening.
The Money Show on 702.
Monday to Friday, 6 to 8 p.m.
I'm just reflecting a little bit on the conversation we had around solar panels and the sort of requirements. And it seems to me one of the reasons there's a kind of almost hysteria around it is just the lack of information that we're getting from Eskom, the lack of clarity. But I think also if people are going to be told you need to pay X for some reason, I don't mind paying an administration fee of a couple of R100. That's fine. I don't think anyone could reasonably object to that. But if someone comes and says to comply, you need to pay several thousand, the question, of course, would be for what? what would need to change? What would need to happen? And it also can't be something that takes months. I mean, you would surely be able to go through a long list of these things. I mean, I would presume that any team or any one person would be able to inspect a solar panel installation in, I don't know, an hour. So you probably could do moving around, do your areas carefully, use a GPS. You could probably do 10 or 12 a day. No, depending, obviously. But just still trying to understand what exactly is happening here. I am concerned deeply that all this is going to do is encourage, I suppose, a bit more class warfare, people leaving a system that is supposed to help everybody. And when the rich pull out of a system that is supposed to help subsidize the poor, we're going to be in deep trouble. And that's my great concern at the moment. You're with The Money Show at 7 o'clock.
And now, The Money Show
with Stephen Grootes on 702.
Let's walk the talk.
The Money Show with Stephen Grootes is brought to you by Absa Corporate and Investment Banking, proud host of Beyond the Budget 2025, where they are reimagining inclusive and sustainable economic growth. There's some people who go through phases of when they're kind of okay and then they're furiously busy. One of them, I think, as a group, might be futurists, because I think sometimes, you know, maybe the 90s, things puddle along. It's the end of history after all. And then suddenly a pandemic comes along and they're furiously busy and that's done. And then think, okay, back to normal. I wonder if they feel the same. We'll ask Graeme Codrington in just a moment how busy he's been with everything that's going on at the moment. He'll be talking about the future of insurance. Lebo Ramafoko is your shapeshifter this evening, the social justice activist. She's been working for Oxfam. One of the questions I want to ask is she moved from Soul City, which I'm sure you've heard of, to Oxfam and became part of a much bigger international thing. They produce, for example, a global inequality report every year. What's it like to move from a kind of local thing? You have a lot more control. You can do a lot more in some smaller areas to a much bigger thing. And that might be an experience you've had or want to have at some point. Wendy Nola, talking about vehicle owners. What happens if someone makes off with your car through trickery? There's a strange clause you might want to know about. All of that to come this evening on The Money Show.
702.
702.
Stephen is on The Money Show.
6 to 8 p.m.
So momentum shares are up very strongly today, and for a very interesting reason. One of the reasons is that they had better weather. Now, it's an insurance company. What does that have to do with the weather? It means they had fewer weather-related claims, but it was only a 6-month update. You can't take that as any kind of long-term indication. And this is going to become more and more important. For example, in Los Angeles, it turns out that many people who lost their homes during the Los Angeles fires didn't have their homes insured. Imagine coming back after a fire, looking at the wreckage, looking at the ashes, and then realizing you really can't make yourself whole again. Well, Graeme Codrington, the futurist and partner at Tomorrow Today, is in our studio. Graeme, you're looking a little overworked at the moment. Good evening. A lot going on in your world.
It is, as you were saying a moment ago, Stephen, it's a crazy time. When the world goes crazy, people ask us scenario planners, what's going on? And I suppose our answer is, we told you. You know, we said to stretch your strategic imagination, to think about what the craziest thing is that you could imagine. And right now, sort of not crazy enough. Think more crazy, because it's just the normal is the new crazy. Yeah.
I mean, the fact that someone can be elected, you know, could do very well in a German election and say we need to build a nuclear bomb was unthinkable 5 years ago. Yeah. And this is where we are. All right. You spent the day at an insurance industry summit. There's a lot for them to look at, particularly around weather events. I mean, what are they concerned about at the moment?
Yeah, well, as you were saying, some big American insurers, to name some names if people know them, State Farm is probably the leading one. I think they're the third or fourth biggest. They announced a few years ago, actually, that they were no longer insuring properties in California for wildfires. And it's just because the wildfires are too big and too destructive, and the premiums wouldn't be affordable. But you then have a devastating wildfire come through, as we've seen in Los Angeles in January, and people just don't have any cover for that, and that's crazy. And I think that is going to become a global issue. Some of the stats that were thrown out, the conference I was at was at I2 Renew Summit, and they were looking specifically at insuring renewable energy, but there were some interesting stats about what's going on across the insurance industry. And the stat that stood out to me is that weather-related insurance payouts in the last 2 years have topped $100 billion.
I can't even imagine that.
Well,
number.
exactly. There's just too many zeros and billions. We know our brains can't get around that. So here's another way to look at it. 5 years ago, you would have a $1 billion insurance claim for a weather incident, a hurricane, a wildfire, a massive tornado, or a flood, or whatever. And it would total $1 billion. You'd have that about once every 18 months. So once every other year, you'd have this big $1 billion thing. Right now, it's every 38 days.
Wow.
There is at least $1 billion. But some of them, like the Los Angeles fire, that's going to be tens of billions of dollars of claims, if the claims are in fact going to be paid out. So that's the magnitude of the shift, Stephen, in the last just 3 or 4 years, as I think we have tipped over that 1.5 degree increase, and now massive weather systems coming through all around the world.
So, I mean, in South Africa, there's sort of two things that happen with climate change. The one is that we're expected as Southern Africa to heat more quickly than other places. But Northern Hemisphere summers will be hotter because there's more land mass there. And so, for example, if you're in Spain, you're going to have really, really intense weather. But this is going to affect our industry and us big time.
Well, the thing is that we've got to get our heads around that. I think the real language is extreme weather. So, there's culture war conversations about climate change, and is it man-made, and is it natural cycles, and so on. And I mean, I think the science, I think the science is very clear. But let's even put that to the side and say there might be some question marks somewhere. There's no question marks about the extreme weather conditions. That if you're in a hurricane region, luckily that's the one thing we're not in South Africa. But Argentina had hurricane-level winds 2 weeks ago. So without the hurricane, but the winds at that speed. And you're talking solar panels earlier in the show. When you put a 150-kilometer wind across the top of your roof, your solar panels disappear.
Yeah.
But then it's hail events, and people in South Africa, especially here in the hail belt from Joburg eastwards, it's the severity of the hail, the size of the hail, the severity of the storms. In winter, our winters will be colder, our summers will be hotter. When we have the El Niño effect and there's a drought, it'll be deeper. When we have the opposite effect, again, Joburg underwater the whole of last week. So it's just that extreme nature of the weather. And the insurers, who are the experts in the world at saying, we can quantify this risk. We can put a number to it, and we can tell you what it is, and it's got a monetary value. They're saying it's just too risky. We can't insure this.
So, I mean, okay, if you run a business, if you own a home in Joburg and you're watching this happen, I mean, what do you do? Do you panic? Do you build a tunnel?
Well, they were interesting. If we go back to the LA fires, there were interesting pictures. Some of them were AI-generated nonsense, which is flooding our news lines these days. But there were some houses that survived. And if you've been to America, you'll know that a lot of their houses are built out of wood.
Yeah, which is something we don't do.
We don't do. So what we need to be doing is saying, can we mitigate against some of these things? So if you're in a flood region like a lot of KZN is, how do you mitigate? If don't build your factory on a floodplain to start with. That should be fairly obvious, but definitely more so these days. It might add a little bit of cost to the initial construction, but we need to be thinking that way. And there might be early warning systems in place. There might be lightning rods that go up and things like that. So mitigation certainly is a starting point. The experts would say that there's no such thing as uninsured. There's just how much can you afford in terms of the premiums. And it might be that there's an opportunity in the insurance industry for insurers who, if you're looking at it from a London global perspective, it might feel a little bit too expensive, but there might be local insurers with more local knowledge who can do a better job of that. So that's a possibility. But I suppose the biggest answer, but it's not a quick fix, is that this is just one more reason for us to take green, ESG, climate change seriously. And here again, I must publicly declare that I don't agree with Trump, Musk et al. And their approach. I mean, Donald Trump was ripping out EV charging stations from federal buildings because somehow he's allergic to anything that is green at the moment. And that just feels like too much of an overreaction to me.
At a time when Texas gets 1/3 of its electricity, or more now, I think, from solar installations. So, I mean, it makes no sense.
And Texas has also, to give a data point from the I2 conference today, the data point is that Texas is now the hailstone solar panel damage capital of the world. And the insurers are panicking about how do they insure these big installations when hail is the big issue.
So, I mean, we think of it as individuals about how do we get insurance, how do we manage that. The insurance industry will be thinking, how do we keep an industry? Because home and business insurance is a big part of what they do. So without that, I mean, they're in real trouble. So there'll be some innovation in this space.
There will be, and as far as I could see at the conference today, quite a lot of the thinking, quite a few of the sessions were actually engineers and specialists who weren't the insurance guys, but they were the guys who were saying, well, how do we make sure that these insurable events are mitigated and dealt with? So, how do you protect your battery? That if one battery goes bad, you don't burn the whole battery bank down, for example. If your solar panels, if you have to put solar panels in an area where there's hail and wind, how do you put an additional mechanism on them so that they can move positions when you get a weather warning and so on? So we get the weather warnings. The weather doesn't come from nowhere. We could put early warning systems in place for some of these climate issues. And I think insurers that move towards preventing the insurable event to start with are probably going to find that they've got a product and a service to offer the market.
Graeme Codrington, good to see you. Thank you. Futurist and partner at Tomorrow Today.
The Money Show.
Consumer Ninja.
Well, we'll continue the conversation around insurance. Wendy Nola, of course, is your consumer ninja. Wendy, good evening. It's a fascinating question.
Hi, Stephen.
So often you'll take your car, you'll give it to a valet, you'll give it to someone to wash it, and you'll give your car keys to them. What happens then if something happens to the car? And you have a spectacular case study about it.
I do. It's a clause that sits, an exclusion clause that sits in apparently quite a few basic, car insurance policies. I've been, covering insurance issues for more than 2 decades now, Stephen, and I have to say, I didn't know this existed. And I've warned about nominated driver policies where, unlike most policies where you have to state your regular driver, and if you have a claim, and you're not the regular driver, in other words, anyway, they will allow other people to drive the car occasionally, right? If you block someone in their driveway and they say, well, they take your car to get a pizza or whatever, and they have a crash, then most insurers will cover that, right? Because the person that borrowed your car wasn't really the regular driver, and they can't say, well, we didn't cover for that risk. But some of these policies, they seem cheaper, but unless the person on the policy, say you and your spouse, for example, or you and your whoever, if someone else takes your car, as you say, the valet, the whatever, the dealership mechanic, and they have an incident, there's no cover. So you've got to be worried, really check for that, the nominated driver policy. So I knew about that, but what I didn't know is about a clause in a lot of, apparently it's fairly standard, and it goes something like this. The policy does not cover loss directly arising from or caused by or resulting from any fraudulent scheme, trick, or device practiced on you or any person having custody of your property. And it was apparently inserted some years ago by most insurers to cover the scenario where you put an ad in to sell your car and someone comes and pretends to be a buyer and then drives off in your car. But the more likely scenario now is that, it would still obviously then cover you've taken your car for a service or a tire fitment or a car wash or whatever. So Caroline Woodley of KZN discovered that this clause existed about 5 months ago, last September, when her almost new 2024 Ford Everest, value of about 1.3 million, was stolen from a car wash adjacent to her office. She left the keys with the manager, personally handed over to him. She knew him well. The car wash is adjacent to her office premises, so she does this. She'd done it several times before, had a high trust level. But later a man arrived at the car wash, and this is all captured on their CCTV cameras, claiming to have been sent by her to collect the car. And the footage shows him liaising with the manager and paying for the car wash, and then driving off in this expensive vehicle.
It's really quite incredible that this can happen. Obviously, a very sort of cool customer who was able to do this. I mean, so what does the insurance ombud have to say about it?
So she did go to the ombud, and one of the many videos she published on TikTok around November around her whole experience as a warning to others was that her insurer, Guardrisk, said sorry for you and pointed out this clause. So I went to what used to be the short-term insurance ombud. It's now the non-life division of the National Financial Ombudsman. Their senior adjudicator, Peter Nkuna, said this is a standard policy wording, a standard clause, exclusion clause. He didn't want to go into the specifics of Caroline's case, but we already know from her that her claim was, her complaint went the way of her insurer, so she didn't win there. And Nkuna says the policy exclusion is very clear and straightforward and very widely couched to encompass the circumstances of the claim. That is loss resulting from any fraudulent scheme, trick, or device practiced on you or any person having custody of your property. And I've had many cases, Stephen, where someone you take your car in for a service. You leave your keys, obviously, and someone walks in and pretends that they've been sent by you, and no checks are done, and off the vehicle goes. And you think it's always such a pain to go through the dealership's insurers, and you think, well, this is what I've got insurance for, right? But no, this clause is there. And I said, how common is it? He said, it's fairly common. I said, do you deal with many complaints around this, such as Caroline Woodley's? And he said, what was the word? Something like, yes, it's reasonably regularly, he said, which makes me even more amazed that I haven't had one of these cases.
And then, okay, how do you protect yourself against it? What do you need to do?
You need to find out whether your policy has this clause, first of all. In Caroline's case, it was something like on page 177 of more than 200 pages of policy. So find out from your broker, or if you got directly insured directly from your insurer, if it's there, and know this before you hand over your car to your dealership or car wash or anyone else. And if it's there, I would say it would be a very good idea to shop around for an insurer that has a policy that's much more consumer friendly on this one. And I think there needs to be a lot more around disclosure. I don't know how it could possibly tick the treating customers fairly obligation on behalf of financial services providers to just put it on page 177 and not make sure the broker mentions it, not make sure that when you're taking out the policy that they specifically mentioned this to you, given the crime levels and given that it's not uncommon for somebody to do that. It's normal practice, right? You hand over your keys to a third party. If they get then tricked into, giving over your car to someone that isn't you, you really do want to be covered for that, right? It's no fault of your own, and you didn't do anything that was negligent. So there you go. Please dive into your policy schedules and look for this clause, or make a call and then act accordingly to protect yourself.
Wendy Knowler, your consumer ninja, thank you very much indeed. It really does raise all sorts of questions about the phrase trickery is really interesting. It really boils down to something else, though, about what you do with your car keys and where they go. And maybe that's the big thing, is to make sure that you, I suppose, as much as you can, keep them with you. Very difficult to do. I mean, at an airport, for example, parking at an airport nowadays is very expensive. You want to use one of the valet services that take it off site. What happens in a situation like that does make you wonder. There are all sorts of other questions, of course, to ask about all of this. Very interesting. Wendy, thank you very much indeed. You at The Money Show, 7:30. Lebo Ramafoko, you'll know, is a social justice activist, spent a long time at Oxfam, spent time before that at Soul City, which I think is the first time that I came across her name. And she's in our studio now. Lebo, bring the microphone down just a little bit. Good evening. Good to see you. Thanks so much for coming in and agreeing to be our shapeshifter tonight.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
So, I mean, I know you as an activist. You're very... May I use the word passionate? I mean,
Passionate defines me, yes.
I know some people don't like that word. Did you grow up with that? I mean, when you were at school, was social activism something you were always going to do? Was it something you fell into later?
So I think there were a number of events in my life, in my upbringing, that brought it up one way or the other. One was obviously being born in apartheid South Africa, and the differences were just so vivid. I come from a community, a very small community in the West End called Manziville, and literally there is a street dividing Manziville and a suburb we later lived in called Danpinarville. So there's stark, differences. But I also remember growing up and noticing how boys and girls are treated differently.
Yeah.
And really not having language to understand it. Just somewhere at the back of my mind, understanding that there is something unfair, about girls cleaning and boys climbing trees and doing the things that I wanted to do. But always, we were brought up by our grandmother, maternal grandmother. Always the code of what girls can do and cannot do at that time was defined. And in a lot of ways, I think it also shaped who I am. So I'm not critical of it. But I'm just saying that upbringing also informed, just how I started seeing the world later on. But the other issue that shaped me was my dad. I was the eldest, and I think the way my dad was present in my life was his way of being, a first-time parent. And he used to put me on his lap. My mother was a nurse and would do night duty. And my father would put me, when my mother wasn't there, on his lap and read the World newspaper.
Yes.
I'm 54 this year, so I'm dating myself that way. Yes. And he would also write to, address envelopes and put 10 rands, which was a lot of money back then, to World Vision. You remember those very terrible ads about, there are people suffering out there. All of those things I realize now throughout my life shaped who I was, as a young person. And I remember around 13 or 14 encountering a magazine called Agenda. And I didn't know that one of my very good friends who I met at Soul City, Dr. Shirin Asden, had contributed to it. And I started seeing words like patriarchy, feminism. When I read an article in there, I looked around to see who was watching me because I thought I had discovered banned literature. All of a sudden, there was language to the things that I felt, that I experienced. But also coming from a family that, despite growing up in a township, my grandmother lived in a 2-roomed house. We lived in a 3-roomed house. In my home, the kitchen and the bathroom was a shack at the back with a stove. Is that there was a lot of pride where I came from in education. And I chuckle sometimes when I think about it because my aunt, who was also a great influence in my life, was a teacher and my mother was a nurse, is that I think we were brought up very middle class, even in those conditions. So there was pride in going to school. There was pride in doing well at school. And my aunt was the penultimate teacher, taught in a rural school in what is now around Pick and Wood, Hartebees Hoek. And was in a farm school, but, really wanted excellence for the learners. So it's a combination of those that came before me, their struggles, but also the values that they instilled in us that really shaped my activism. More than what became activism, toi-toi kind of thing. Yeah.
One of the things that I've often seen about you in the conversations, and I remember one or two are a bit difficult for various reasons at times, and these things happen, is it seems to me that one of the things about South Africa is that it doesn't know how different it is to itself. By which I mean that we don't know very much about people who have grown up in a very different way to us. And that was deliberate. I mean, that's what Rivett wanted, and we still see that to a large extent. Have you seen it maybe Because it seems to me sometimes one of your missions maybe is to explain South Africa to itself, and that can be quite hard to do. It doesn't always want to know, if you know what I mean.
You know, Stephen, and Soul City, where actually I spent most of my life, was quite formidable.
It's an incredibly impressive institution.
Yeah, formation, because it put the role of story at the center. And it also started just at the dawn of our democracy. And why that is important is for two reasons, to your question, is the value of story for us to start really understanding not only at that time health and development issues, but who we were. I remember before I joined Soul City coming on air in May, I had stayed behind at our offices. I was working at an organization called Allset. I was young. So what I'm going to say right now, forgive me, I was young. And I stayed so that I could abuse the company phone to call my boyfriend. And then I saw Soul City on air. And what struck me was Connie Ferguson, was Lillian Dube, and other black people on television when I grew up on Trompi and Diboxom Bende.
Yeah.
And I think hearing your language, seeing your black people with agency and stories that you can relate to. So they are not like in a soapy, they are not in a mansion. They are in the township and they are dealing with issues that are real. Soul City did not know that their advert that they had placed on the Mail and Guardian newspaper there had been published until I called them to ask them if they received my CV via fax. And I think just watching it a few months earlier really was compelling about the role of story and of narrative. And I believe that particularly in this world right now that is very polarized, that is also very important. I just find even in my work, in leadership, in positions that I have held, sitting in the kitchen with somebody who comes from an environment that you don't know and really asking them about, you know, their own life can give you such a deep sense of the complexity of human beings. And in a lot of ways, I think we've grown accustomed to think in monotones and not in the complexity that life is. I also think that I've made it my personal mission, particularly on issues I feel really, really strong about, around gender, around, you know, speaking about issues that affect the marginalized, is that we often, particularly as we become middle class, we become educated and other things, often do not ask ourselves who is not at the table.
Yeah.
Who is not there to represent themselves. And I'm not a representative of all black people or all black women, but where I come from and the stories of my grandmother, I mean, we've got a cousin who I know is listening, by the way, because he told me he will, who will, you know, share a lot of our stories. And I think very recently, as in last year or the year before, found letters that my mother and his mother, who were sisters, wrote to each other. One who was studying to be a teacher and one who was studying to be a nurse, and about how they would talk about the poverty that they experienced. And, you know, we can talk about stats. We can talk about 1 in so many people go to bed hungry, but nothing concretizes it like story. So story and narrative have always been, you know, something that I feel very strongly about, but also shifting the narrative. You know, it's not only telling stories. So when I've been here before with people like Eusebius, may his soul rest in peace, and others, and I've been interviewed by you and others, is that the importance for me is saying who is shaping the narrative about the world that we see right now. And looking at what is happening with us in the US right now, with social media and others, you can see why that shaping the narrative is almost going to be the only task we will ever have to do about shaping the narrative around transformation, around reconciliation, around change in the world, and how, if we are not careful, we can even regress some of the gains that we have had in previous years.
It's such an interesting comment, that, because, I mean, this is the money show, so I have to take it back there. But when you talk about shaping a narrative, the same holds true for someone who's leading a company or an institution, someone who's leading Soul City or someone who's leading, you know, a bank. You actually need to shape a narrative around
Absolutely.
it. It needs to fit in that, and then people need to fit into the narrative.
Absolutely. And in my professional growth, I've actually realized that, particularly when you are at the lead, that is the most important role that you can play. You work with others who basically pay attention to detail, So if you are working and you've got a COO or you are having a CFO or a finance manager, or in our field with programs people, you want to have people who are competent in the tasks and the technical tasks that they have. What do you do as a leader is to sell a vision. And in some instances, and I've been very fortunate in my career that I have also been at the helm of Soul City when it revisioned itself from a health and development communication organization to a feminist organization for young women and girls. And I can tell you that it took 3 years of consistent work, asking the questions that needed to be asked, which is the role of strategy, looking forward and saying, are we still relevant? Will we still be relevant? Where are the problems as we see them? And I think one of the things that I have realized is that I probably have a naive bravery in a sense that, I can dream and I can think about things. And I love the fact that I will work with people who will say, hang on, come back to earth, know. But that is important in shaping a future that sometimes some people, particularly those that want to be convinced by concrete facts, which are equally important, want to shape the story. And then when you work particularly in the not-for-profit sector, that story is important for fundraising.
Sure.
So who are you sitting in front of who must care about a community in Manziville or in Pitsidi Sulejang? It's all narrative.
And I mean, stories come from strange places, right? There will be children in sort of grade 9, grade 10 at IB, independent schools, who will be sitting next to, so they'll be middle-class suburban people, no idea what a township existence is like, sitting next to children who do. But the only experience they will have is reading Trevor Noah's book because it's one of the IB prescribed works. And when I realized that, and Trevor Noah talks about, being in a township and all the rest, and I was like struck by what that tells us about how our society, that a black child has to go to New York to get his book about his experience in those schools. I'm not having a go at the IEB. I'm just making a comment about our society.
I mean, I think there's a lot that one can glean from that, and that is, what is the role of education?
Yeah.
And has education in our society played the role that it should? And there is a place for private education.
Yeah.
And I've had the pleasure of being invited by Alan Makubani, a very, very, inspirational young person who was, I think, at St. John's, and I've spoken at many places as well. And I think at St. John's I went more than once. And that is about really pricking at the consciousness of parents who work hard and who want to secure their children's futures. So their rational thought about sending their children to all of these, schools. Some of them, I get intimidated when I walk in some of these.
They look like castles.
They are castles and they've got this rich history, etc. About what is the role of education. Are we training young people or the people who go through the education system, public or private, to really, really be citizens that will survive in the world because they understand its complexity, or those that due to either superiority or inferiority will basically believe that they are superior or they are inferior depending on where they come from. And I think the greatest failure for me in our society 30 years after democracy is that we've really not had a very deliberate agenda to really problematize things that we are talking about. And right now, while in the past divisions were largely around race and they are still racialized, they are now around class. If you can afford it, you can buy it, and you can almost close yourself from the environment. And people argue very hard about why is their right and choice and stuff, and that is great that people are able to afford some of these things. But the question that remains is, what is the hidden curriculum that comes with it, but also what kind of a society are we shaping. And sometimes if social media is anything to go by, sometimes when I look at the ahistoricism that you find on social media, I'm like, we failed somewhere. We just failed because we were not intentional in basically really saying what is the kind of education system that we want. I remember being a student teacher, and even when my daughter was in a private primary school, I will not name, an amazing school. It did wonders for my for my daughter, that the school was saying they will not allow the school to take grade 7s to the apartheid museum because they don't know what they would do when they come back. Yeah. And my daughter was one of 3 black children in that school, And so those are also some of the, where's the public education, that we need.
We're speaking to Lebo Ramafoko tonight, the social justice activist. He's your shapeshifter on The Money Show. Lebo Ramafoko is your shapeshifter this evening, the social justice activist. And Lebo, I made the point earlier that you first impinged on my consciousness at Soul City. Then you went to Oxfam. And Oxfam's very interesting. You're heading the South African branch, but as part of a much bigger thing, they released an important inequality report. They have resources to do stuff. I imagine that comes with a bit more bureaucracy, especially because they're, British. What was that like, going from something you could control, South African dealing with South African things, to like the similar kind of thing, but a much bigger organization?
I left Soul City at a time that I believed that after 24 years, I had given all that I could to an organization that I loved and loved me back and nourished me. Before I actually went to Soul City, I was at Atlantic Fellows for Health Equity in Cape Town. And when I arrived at Atlantic Fellows for Health Equity, another great organization, I realized that what I wanted for myself and what I had observed at Soul City was the fact that a number of these conversations and issues that we care about, like inequality, poverty, social justice, are really shaped in public platforms. And, Oxfam wasn't initially a natural choice, but when I made that decision to go to Oxfam, it was the best decision that I made. And, Oxfam is a confederation, and as a confederation, you have the benefit of many other organizations that are united around one vision. Now it makes for great, robust conversation. We were speaking about teaching South Africa to itself. But I think what I gained in the years that I spent at Oxfam was the ability to understand just how complex this world is and how, you get solidarity at different levels. So when we speak about, for an example, issues, what is the global south or the global majority? What is the global north? But also the kind of dedication and support that there is from different parts of the world. I was very struck by, for an example, what Oxfam Novib, which is in Amsterdam, had done about basically going to their governments and other Oxfams to basically take their own governments to court or go to court to stop their governments from, selling arms to Israel. Knowing South Africa's role, in the issue in the Middle East, being part of a broader confederation that was basically also from their own vantage points, fighting this. You spoke about the inequality report, and those reports, even before one joined Oxfam, were very critical in helping us produce knowledge and data that will enable us as activists from everywhere else, to participate in that. I hope that the contribution that I made was to also ensure that some of our South African community organizations, like Wendy Pekia from Ubuntu, which is an organization in the Western Cape, working with farm workers, the work that is done and had been done for many years, even before I came, by other organizations that are really advocating for the rights of farm workers who want to ban pesticides, women on farms. is also a way in which we link the global and the local. I didn't get any sense of a bureaucracy, but I think I was also ready professionally for the complexity that organizations of that nature afford. Because, in fact, when you are on public platforms, whether it's the UN Security Council, whether it is CSW, whether it is forums at the AU, knowing that you actually stand on behalf of such a well-respected confederation and brand was a blessing. And having participated and having a voice, because I think the other thing that I had to do for myself is to say, where's my voice? And having a voice in that space was also quite great.
Lebo Ramaphosa could go on forever. Thank you so much for coming in. Really appreciate it. The social justice activist, your shapeshifter on The Money Show tonight.